Brothers and sisters, peace be with you. Today we read on 1 King chapter 7. Chapter 7 continue after chapter 6. Chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6, verse 38, verse 8, and then go straight to the chapter 7, the whole chapter. Yesterday we talked about it is important, it's very important to build temple, but it's most important to follow God. During the whole process of building temple, something happened. That's chapter 6, verse 11 to 13. At the start, Solomon didn't start off good. As soon as he took the throne, he got married. The Pharaoh's daughter. That was not his first wife, actually. So he was trying to, marriage is kind of like the diplomatic tools. Egypt was an influential, big country at the time, powerful. So to him, did he rely on God or on the world? And he did rely on the world. He asked God for wisdom. He said he was a little child. He didn't know how to go out and come in. And this is a great people. He needs to judge between them. How can he go out and in? That's in chapter 3. He doesn't know how to judge them, how to go out and come in. So God gave him a really broad mind with understanding and wisdom. A big heart. God affirmed him right there. God appeared to him at Gibeon. That's in chapter 3, verse 5. He didn't do too well, and yet God accepted him regardless. God has chosen some imperfects and people with flaws. God also chooses them. Now we talk about him building temple. He arose and built the temple of God. On the fourth year of his reign, he started building the temple of God. It was a bit late. And yet God was pleased with him. That's why during the whole building project, it took him 7 years and a half to finish it. God also spoke to him during that, and the word of God came to him, saying, concerning this temple which you are building, you must follow me wholeheartedly. Walk in my statutes, execute my judgment, keep all my commandments, and walk in them. Then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father David. Chapter 6, verse 12. And I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. That's what we mentioned yesterday. That's chapter 6, verse 11, 12. The word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this temple which you are building, God endorsed this temple. God affirmed this, what Solomon built. He started on his 4th year's reign. God said that I accept this one. His kingship was confirmed, endorsed by God. The temple he's built was confirmed by God. During him building temple, God spoke to him. Chapter 6, the end of chapter 6. Verse 37, in the 4th year of the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Sif. That repeats what is said in verse 1. On the 4th year of his reign, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its details and according to all its plans. So he was 7 years in building it. The last line in chapter 6. Strictly speaking, it's actually 7.5 years. Then he finished. So what do we expect to read in chapter 7? The temple was built and finished. How about the articles in the temple? When the tabernacle was built in the time of Moses, there will be golden lampstand, Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, the showbread and the table, and then the golden censers. And then we have the basin, the bronze basin, all kinds of articles required in the temple. We expect that chapter 7 will start talking about this. But there is a sidetrack here in chapter 7. So he became king, and then he built temple. Then the word of God came to him, affirmed him what he was doing. But then the sidetrack in chapter 7, when I read chapter 7 this morning, it was like no good. God really put like cross, no good to him. Verse 1 to 12. Is a cross. It's like not good to the life of Solomon. He did not do well. He stopped the work of the temple of the Lord. He interrupted the recording on the building of this temple. In chapter 7, so at the end of the chapter 6, he was building the temple. So, the temple was finished. Yes, it said that the house was finished in all its details and according to all its plans, but there was still a lot of work yet to be done. Right after that should have been about the articles in the temple. But it was like just the outer structure was done. The hardware overlaid with pure gold, cedar, stones. Yes, the whole overall structure was built. Then it's done. It was finished. It took him 7.5 years. Then he should have put like the articles in the temple, right? You need the what's inside. Yeah, we know about the cherubim, how it was built in the sanctuary, but it's not completed. The temple was built and finished, but not completed. But then, right at the start of chapter 7, verse 1 to 12, the title, Solomon made a lot of effort to build his own house. He spent much effort to build his own house. The effort he put in to build his house was way more than the effort he put to build the temple. Let's read on. Verse 1 to 12 is my main point today. That's the cross that God gave to Solomon. And then verse 13. Verse 13 of chapter 7 continued on chapter 6, verse 38. The articles in the temple. Verse 1 to 12 is of the chapter 7 is kind of like an insert, interrupt the recording of the building of the temple. So I read on chapter 7, verse 1 and 2. But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house, so he finished all his house. He also built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, its width 50 cubits, its weight 30 cubits, with 4 rows of cedar pillars and cedar beams on the pillars. 又建造黎巴嫩宁宫，长100肘，宽50肘，高30肘，有香柏木柱3行，柱上有香柏木驼梁。So Solomon built his own house. He put a much effort in building it. But Solomon, here, verse 1, but Solomon, but his own house built Solomon. But his own house built Solomon 13 years. But and then self combined into one word. But for himself, that's in the original text, is but himself, for himself, something like this. Own house built Solomon 13 years. That's the order, the sequence in the original text. But himself, but Solomon built for himself, own house built 13 years, Solomon. And comma, so he finished, and he fully finished all his house. House appeared twice in verse 1. Can you see? His own house, and he finished all his house. But for himself, Solomon built his own house 13 years. His house, it took him 13 years to finish his house, all his house. So he finished all his house, and he finished them all. What did Solomon do exactly? Solomon built his own house. The house should be in Jerusalem. That's where he dwelled. It took him 13 years to build his own house in Jerusalem. It's a bit ambiguous here. It's a bit unclear. He did not just build one house. As we read on, he has built quite a lot of his houses. But it took him 13 years to build his house. But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house. Does it refer to the house in Jerusalem only, or counting all the houses Solomon built? It's not quite clear here. We may say that it took him 13 years to build all his houses, but as I read it in details, that's not the case. His house refers to the one in Jerusalem only. it took him 13 years to build one house in Jerusalem. In the original text, it says, and he also built the house of the forest of Lebanon. That's in Lebanon. That's his house, house of the forest. House of the forest of Lebanon. Verse 2 is a house in the forest. That's even more extraordinary. Its length was 100 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its weight 30 cubits, with 4 rows of cedar pillars and cedar beams on the pillars. Its length was 100 cubits. Its width 50 cubits and its height 30 cubits. Compare this house of the forest with the temple. Remember that we return to the length was the height 30 cubits. Length was 60 cubits. That's in chapter 6, verse 2. Here is 100, length was 100 cubits. Temple, the width is 20. Here is 50 cubits. Compare verse, chapter 6 with chapter 7. And the height of the temple was 30 cubits, same height as his house. But it's much longer, 40 cubits longer than the temple. 20 cubits longer than the temple and wider than the temple as well. The 60 cubits of the temple include the inner sanctuary and the outer sanctuary. So the inner and the outer sanctuary combining was not as long as the house of the forest. And its width, the temple's width was the house width was 50, but the temple was only 20. It's wider by 30 cubits, more than double. Same height. It's really tall, 30 cubits, very tall. During the time of captivity, the Israelites reflect on themselves as the history of Israel was recorded. The kingdom, the dynasty of David and Solomon. That was the Israel's prime. And yet, after that, after Solomon, the kingdom was divided. After Solomon, the kingdom was divided. And then all the way towards its destruction. At the end, the northern kingdom was in captivity. And the whole nation was destroyed. Only the house of Judah was remained. It survived for another 11 years. It has survived for a period of time. And then they were in captivity again as well, the house of Judah. After they were in captivity and then the nation destroyed, then they reflect on themselves. What happened? How come the kingdom of Solomon did not last? So Solomon succeeded the throne of David after Solomon. That's Rehoboam. What happened? Why would we end up like this? Why would Rehoboam be like the way he was? He was going downhill. Yes, there were times that there were like a revival. But what is God telling us through the Israel history? So we have this prerequisite here. We need to understand the Israelites. When they read their own history, they know that God started their nation. So starting from Moses, Abraham, Moses, starting from Abraham and then Moses, God chose Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And then the time of Joshua, God wanted to be their king. But then during the time of Samuel, they want to set up their own king. Then God said, you want to be not like the nations to have a king rule over you. Okay, you can have your own king. Okay, I can support you. As long as you listen to me, then okay, I let you have king. But no, they couldn't. It didn't go well. Who became king of Israel? It was Saul was the first king. Saul was not good. Then David was chosen. God, he was after God's own heart. But there was a lot of problems with David. But yes, he did what was right in the eyes of God, mostly. But then now it comes to the time of Solomon. How about Solomon? All the way to... So Israel, looking at, they consider the nation in the hand of God, established by God, in order to show the will of God. So when they look back at the Israel history, they will see how God has been leading them and what's wrong with man, so that we may reflect. We know God rules over all. Today we walk forward, even though we are in captivity. God says that our nation can be re-established. We will return. So what should we do now? That's where they reflect themselves. Because they believe God rules over all. And through human history, through Israel history, they see the faithfulness of God. And yet they see the flaws of human. That's why today we may change ourselves and continue to walk in God's faithfulness. Then at this point they think to themselves, it was very important for Solomon to build temple, but most important is to follow God. God promised him during his construction, but when he was building house of the forest of Lebanon, he was trying to marry the Gentile as diplomacy. Did God endorse those behavior of him? Did God endorse him? No, God did not. On the other hand, it became the side stories of him building construction. It interrupted him building temple. The articles in the temple was not mentioned. God said, they reflect, oh, I see, the people, the Israelites, Solomon made his own house bigger, more magnificent than the temple of the Lord. The first one, but for himself, built 13 years. But for himself, it took him 7 years in building temple, but for his own house, 13 years. They deeply repent. We want to do it for ourselves. We want to serve God, but it's actually for ourselves. The temple of God compared to man's own house, house of the forest of Lebanon, house of forest, such a difference. Not just one house. Chapter 7, verse 2, he built the house of the forest of Lebanon. Besides building his house in Jerusalem, 13 years took him. He took 13 years to finish, and he built the house of the forest of Lebanon. It didn't mention how long it took him. I believe the 13 years did not include building the house of the forest of Lebanon. 13 years to build his own house. Build a house of forest of Lebanon, we don't know how long it took him. And this house of forest of Lebanon was more magnificent than the temple, greater, larger than the temple of God. Due to the time, we need to be a bit more, we need to go a bit quick. Verse 3 and 4, 5 tells us what happened, what's the situation in the house of the forest. 100 cubits long and 50 panels of cedar wood, 15 to a row. In the original text, it says 4 rows of cedar pillars. It says 4 rows. And then 15 to a row, so that would be 60. Okay. And then it says 45 pillars. So the Chinese would say 3 rows of cedar pillars in verse 2. Okay. 50 cubits wide, 100 cubits long, and then divided into 3 or 4 rows, 15 to a row. And they build the structure of the house of the forest. And then there are beveled frames in 3 rows, and windows was opposite windows in 3 tiers. Verse 4. And all the doorways and doorposts had rectangular frames. First one is the house in Jerusalem. The second one built the house of the forest of Lebanon. What I just mentioned. The third one, hall of pillars. Verse 6, he also made the hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits and its width 30 cubits, and in front of them was a portico with pillars. And a canopy was in front of them. House of the forest of Lebanon. Besides this, huge, gigantic building that is much bigger than the temple, there is a hall of pillars. Its length was 50 cubits, and its width 30 cubits. Before this, in front of the house of the forest of Lebanon, there was this hall of pillars. And then there is a hall for the throne, the hall of judgment. There is hall about hall. And there are like pillars, one building. There is a hall, and then there is another hall above that, in front of it. The third building, the third hall, the house of palace, house of pillars, hall of pillars. This hall of pillars should be in front of the house of the palace. The fourth one, verse 7, then he made a hall for the throne, the hall of judgment. where he might judge, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling.
又建造一廊，其中设立审判的座位。这廊从地到顶都用香柏木遮蔽。
The third building, the fourth building, sorry, fourth. Besides the hall in front of the house of the forest of Lebanon, and there is another hall for the throne, the hall of judgment.
廊子就是用来听审的。
The hall of for the throne where he might judge. And the fifth one, the fifth building. And the house where he dwelt had another court inside the hall of like workmanship. And verse 8. This verse 8 is hard. It took me a long time. I don't understand. I try to understand verse 8. At the end, I decide it's another independent building. That's where he dwelt. He did not dwell in the house of the forest of Lebanon. So what is the house of forest of Lebanon for? Maybe entertaining function room or entertain the foreign envoy, maybe have some meeting or somewhere he can enjoy himself. It's a multi-purpose house. He also have his own house. It's near this house of forest and near the hall of judgment where he worked. He had his workplace where he judged, and then he lived there, and then he had somewhere to host the people. Where he lived was the fifth building of like workmanship. That means it's a scale of like workmanship. That means it's of scale, similar scale. It's similar to the hall of judgment. There it was his house of forest, his workplace, where he dwelt. That's the fifth building. The sixth building, Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as wife. So where he dwelt, he also built another hall for Pharaoh's daughter. So when he went there, so did Pharaoh's daughter. So he also built a house for her. Six buildings in total, from verse 1 to 8. 6 buildings. All these were of costly stones cut to size, trimmed with saws inside and out from the foundation to the eaves, and also on the outside to the great court. From the foundation to the eaves and also on the outside to the greater court, all of costly stones. Even the foundation, which was invisible, was of costly stones, trimmed, cut to size, trimmed with saws. Precious stones. Verse 10, the foundation was of costly stones, large stones, some 10 cubits and some 8 cubits. And above were costly stone hewn to size and cedar wood. Verse 11. Costly stone, the third time, right? Verse 9, 10, and 11. The great court was enclosed with 3 rows of hewn stones and a row of cedar beams. So were the inner courts of the house of the Lord and the vestibules of the temple. When we talk about building the temple in chapter 6, so it was from. So they have the stone all built, and they were built with stone finished at the quarry. But the 6 buildings that Solomon built for himself, these are of costly stones. Verse 9, 10, and 11. Costly stones. Verse 10, the foundation was of costly stones, large stones, and some 10 cubits and some 8 cubits. They are not just costly stones, they are large stones. Some 10 cubits and some 8 cubits. They are big, large stones, cut to size, trimmed with saw, smooth, all cut to size. But building the temple, it was built with stone finish at the quarry. That's in chapter 6, verse 7. The material he used in the building his own house compared with the material he used building the temple. The material he used was way better, way costly, more costly. And then his court was just like close to the pattern in the temple. Yes, similar pattern, but much more expensive materials and much bigger. For people in the captivity, that's the reflection of the Israelites. That's how Solomon built temple. That's how he builds his own houses. So many buildings, right? 6. Compare with him building the temple. It's unequal, totally you cannot compare the temple with his houses. Cannot compare. The stone finished at the quarry. And here, costly stones, large stones. 5 big buildings, giant buildings, and 1 temple of God. A lot of reflections here. 7 years in building the temple. Just his one house in Jerusalem, 13 years. And also many other buildings. How did God bless him? How could he? What's wrong here? Man's problem is we care about our families, ourselves more than we care about God. We try to finish the whole chapter first. Verse 13 to 47, the second paragraph, talk about Huram, his skill, his craftsmanship, how he built temple. He was the smith. So bronze pillars, bronze sea, bronze. The bronze sea was huge. Verse 23, the sea of cast bronze, the 23 to 26. And then there are 12, verse 26. How many water can it contain, this sea of cast bronze? 2,000 baths, 26. 1 bath equals to 22 liters. 22 liters. 22 times 2,000. So it's 44,000, right? 44,000 liters. That's the volume. It's a big container, this sea of cast bronze. But during captivity, of course, this sea of cast bronze was also taken away and destroyed. All these magnificent buildings, all these bronze, gold articles, all lost during captivity. Before the nation was destroyed, the Israel king would go into the temple and then just cut out the pure gold and pay tribute to Assyrian. Other country just loot, plunder, and took away all these bronze articles. They reflect themselves. Are we doing this? Are we doing it for God or for ourselves? Solomon had his flaws here. On the matter of him marrying Pharaoh's daughter, God did not rebuke him. And yet, during the captivity, the comment of God over him was bad because the first thing he did was to marry Pharaoh's daughter. Jeremiah kept saying again and again, telling the Israelites not to do one thing. You go to Egypt, the broken cistern, and you left this living water, the well of living water. You are going to Egypt again? That's Jeremiah. When the nation started to go downhill to be destroyed, and when the nation was totally destroyed, their heart wanted to rely on Egypt alone. Then the reflection they had during captivity, Solomon built houses for himself, way stronger, much more efforts than building temple for the Lord. Everything he made was in ruin. His house destroyed. Verse 48 to the end, that's the third paragraph. Then he recorded the furnishing in the house of God. Altar of gold, the tabernacle of gold on which the showbread, the lampstand, 5 lampstand, golden lampstand. And then the articles to be used on and the gold basins, etc. And also the doors for the inner room, the most holy place, and for the doors for the main hall of the temple. After he has done all this, then he finished. And then he moved what his father has dedicated. We saw the problem. We see the problems of David. He spent much effort building his own houses. I would not say that reluctantly he builds a house of God. He builds the temple of the Lord, but he regards highly, he esteems more highly of his own houses. So, brother and sister, we are sitting here, or maybe you're watching online, or you are in your own city. What is your attitude? Do we spend much effort to build our own houses? Or do we build the house of God? 2 reflections here. The first one, you build your own life. That's the temple of the Lord. More, you spend more effort building your own life, or you build your material possession, the outside world. Do you pursue degree, qualification? You try to add value to yourself? or you in touch with the Holy Spirit dwelling in you. You want more of godly life? You spend time. What do you spend time on every day? How much is your spiritual life? Is it as highly accomplished as your degree? Is it as accomplished as your career? If your spiritual life is not mature, is not strong, but you have great career, I will tell you, one day your career will go into nothing. Just like Solomon. At the end, everything comes to nothing. The second thing, or maybe if for Hong Kong people, we have a big house, we have a big property, or maybe in the mid-level and then very expensive house. Oh, here I got a little bit, I remember something that really upset me. We brought some people to Christ before. But they say that you moved to Cheung Wan. I'm not going to go to Cheung Wan with you. We always just live in Hong Kong Island. We do not go to Kowloon side, let alone Cheung Wan. That's new territories, right? The Kowloon side with the best, we will go to Tsim Sha Tsui. Oh my word. God is here. Because you don't want to go to Cheung Wan or Kowloon side, that's why you don't want to join our church. Really, I met some of these people. You have big house, good area. But how about your own spiritual life? What do you go after? I'm talking about Hong Kong people. We are very low, Hong Kong people. Our life is low. We have God. We have everything. That's the first thing. Your life compare with what you pursue, go after. The second thing, how much do we offer to the church? You offer a lot to the house, to your own family. Just like Solomon, he spent so much effort to build resources to build his own houses. How about building the temple? Yeah, of course, I should build a temple for the Lord, so he did. But he highly esteemed his own house more than the temple of the Lord. How about us? It's something that we should reflect on. To the captivity, to those who are in captivity, those in exile, they reflect. If we think more for ourselves and think less for God, everything, whatever we have will perish. These are not eternal. God himself is eternal. We must serve the eternal living God. And what we do should last till eternity. May this become our life, our value system. May God bless us. That's the end of the message today.